The 30th of June, 1908, began like any other day in the vast, empty wilderness of the Siberian taiga. For the Tungus people, the Evenki, it was a day of familiar rhythms, of checking traps, of watching the reindeer herds, of listening to the profound silence of a world that had not changed in 10,000 years. The sun rose, a pale disk in a sky of impossible blue, and the air held the clean, sharp scent of pine and damp earth. It was a day of absolute normalcy. Until it wasn't. At approximately 7:17 in the morning, local time, the sky broke. It did not fall. It did not crack. It broke. Witnesses hundreds of kilometers away, men and women of the Evenki, Russian fur trappers, settlers in the few hard-won trading posts that clung to the edges of the Podkamenia Tunguska River, all saw it. They described it later with the simple, terrified language of people confronted by something outside of all human experience. They said a second sun appeared. This was no meteor, no fleeting streak of light. This was a brilliant, blinding ball of fire, brighter than the actual sun, that tore across the morning sky from the southeast to the northwest. It moved with an unnatural slowness, a deliberate, terrifying crawl that allowed every person within a 1,000-kilometer radius to witness its passage. It was described as a cylinder, a sphere, a pillar of pure, white-hot light. It left a trail of dust and smoke that scarred the sky for hours. And then, it detonated. Over the empty heart of the forest, with no major town for hundreds of kilometers, the object exploded with a force that defies easy comprehension. The official estimate, the one that scientists would settle on decades later, was somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT. That is roughly 1,000 times the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was a force of nature unleashed, a planetary-scale event. The sound came first as a series of deafening claps, like celestial artillery. Then came the shockwave. It was a physical thing, a moving wall of air that flattened 80 million trees over an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. The trees fell in a radial pattern, a perfect, eerie butterfly shape, their tops all pointing away from a central point. The heat from the blast was so intense that it was felt by people 60 kilometers away, searing their skin, setting their clothes on fire. A reindeer herd was incinerated where it stood, reduced to charred bones in an instant. The seismic shock was registered by observatories across Eurasia. The atmospheric pressure wave traveled around the entire planet. Twice. For several nights afterward, the skies over Europe and Asia glowed with an eerie, silvery light, so bright that people in London could reportedly read newspapers outdoors at midnight. Something fundamental had happened to the Earth's atmosphere. Something had wounded the sky itself. In the isolated trading post of Vanavara, the closest settlement of any size some 65 kilometers from the epicenter, the scene was apocalyptic. A farmer named S.B. Semenov was sitting on his porch when the sky split open. The heat, he said, was so strong he felt his shirt was on fire. The shockwave threw him several meters and knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, the world was chaos. Every window in the village was shattered. The ground was split with fissures. A column of fire and smoke rose on the horizon, a pillar that seemed to connect the wounded earth to the violated sky. This was the Tunguska event. It is the largest impact event in recorded human history. And here is the first, and most important, anomaly. The first crack in the official story that would be painstakingly constructed over the next century. There was no crater. Think about that. An explosion with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs. An event that flattened a forest the size of a major metropolitan area. An impact that shook the entire planet. And it left no mark of its arrival. No hole in the ground. No shattered remnants of the object that caused it. Nothing. The epicenter, the point directly beneath the cataclysm, was a stand of trees, stripped bare of their branches, scorched by unimaginable heat, but still standing upright. They were like a forest of skeletal telephone poles, a silent, ghostly testament to the raw power that had descended from above. The Tsarist government, crumbling under its own internal pressures, and just a few years from total collapse, did nothing. The reports from the remote region were confused, contradictory, and filtered through layers of bureaucracy and disbelief. The witnesses were dismissed as superstitious peasants. The event was filed away, a footnote in a world lurching toward a global war. The forest was left to heal. The silence returned. It would be nearly 2 decades before the first official expedition, led by the Russian mineralogist Leonid Kulik, would fight its way through the unforgiving terrain to reach the site. Kulik was funded by the new Soviet Academy of Sciences. He was a man of science, a man of rocks and minerals. He was looking for a meteorite, a very, very large iron meteorite, the kind that would be worth a fortune to the burgeoning Soviet state. He was certain he would find a massive crater filled with extraterrestrial metal. He spent years searching. He led 4 grueling expeditions into the swampy, insect-infested wilderness. He mapped the entire blast zone, documenting the radial pattern of the fallen trees with meticulous care. He interviewed the surviving Evenki witnesses, painstakingly recording their accounts of the pillar of fire and the second sun. He dug. He drilled. He tested the soil. He found no crater. He found no meteorite fragments. Not a single, solitary ounce of extraterrestrial iron. Leonid Kulik, the man sent to find the evidence of a cosmic impact, became the first and most powerful piece of evidence against it. His own meticulous research, his own tireless work, completely contradicted the very premise of his mission. He died a confused and frustrated man, his life's work ending not with a triumphant discovery, but with a profound and disturbing question mark. But here is what they don't want you to know. The absence of a crater is not a mystery to be solved. It is the answer. The lack of meteorite fragments is not a puzzle. It is the solution. The official story, the one you read in textbooks, of a fragile comet or a stony asteroid that disintegrated completely upon entry into the atmosphere, is a story born of desperation. It is a narrative constructed to fill a vacuum, to provide a simple, comfortable answer to a deeply uncomfortable event. It is an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle. They say a rock fell from the sky. They say it was a random act of cosmic chance, a 1-in-1,000-year event that thankfully happened over an unpopulated area. They say the case is closed. They are lying. The Tunguska event was not an object that came from space. It was a force that was unleashed on Earth. It was not an impact. It was a transmission. To understand what happened in that Siberian forest in 1908, you do not look up at the stars. You look to a different place entirely. You look to a laboratory in Shoreham, Long Island. You look to the mind of a man who was dreaming of a new world, a man who claimed he could command lightning itself. You look to Nikola Tesla. Welcome to the story they tried to erase, the story of what really hit Tunguska. To build this case, we must first dismantle the official narrative. We must do what Leonid Kulik did, and look at the evidence with open eyes, free from the prejudice of expecting to find a simple rock. The primary sources, the accounts of the men and women who saw the event with their own eyes, are the foundation. They were dismissed as unreliable, their stories colored by folklore and fear. But what if they were describing exactly what they saw, with the only words available to them? Let's examine those words. The Evenki hunters spoke of a pillar of fire that descended from the sky. This is a recurring and critical description. A meteorite is a falling object, a point of light moving across the sky. A pillar is something else entirely. It implies a sustained column, a connection. Other witnesses described the object splitting into two, or of a smaller, brighter object separating from the main body just before the explosion. Does this sound like a solid object breaking apart? Or does it sound more like an electrical discharge, an arc of energy making its final, catastrophic connection? They spoke of the sky opening up. This is a common phrase in many of the testimonies. It's a poetic, almost biblical description, but perhaps it is also a literal one. What if what they saw was a rupture in the very fabric of the atmosphere, a hole punched in the ionosphere by an unimaginable concentration of energy? The sounds they described are also profoundly strange. They reported the initial explosion, yes, but many also spoke of a continuous, terrifying roar that lasted for minutes. A sound like a storm of stones falling, or the sound of all the cannons in the world firing at once. A bolide explosion, however large, is a singular event. A bang. This continuous, roaring sound suggests a sustained process, not an instantaneous detonation. It sounds like a machine. It sounds like an engine of immense power running out of control. These are not the descriptions of a simple kinetic impact. They are the descriptions of a complex, multi-stage, energetic event, an electrical event. Then there is the physical evidence on the ground, the evidence Kulik so painstakingly gathered. The butterfly pattern of the fallen trees has long puzzled scientists. A simple airburst from a round object should create a circular or oval pattern of destruction. The elongated, butterfly wing shape of the Tunguska blast zone is an anomaly. It suggests a complex shock wave, or perhaps two distinct but closely timed explosions. It points to a more directed and structured release of energy than a simple, chaotic disintegration. And what of the trees themselves? At the epicenter, the so-called telegraph pole forest, the trees were flash-burned, seared on the sides facing the explosion. The heat was clearly directional and catastrophically intense, but also incredibly brief. It was enough to incinerate bark and branches, but not enough to set the entire forest on fire. A large-scale forest fire, which one would expect from such a cataclysm, never materialized. This suggests a burst of thermal radiation, a flash of pure energy, not the lingering heat of a conventional explosion or impact. Furthermore, subsequent scientific analysis of the area has yielded even stranger results. Studies of tree rings from the period show accelerated growth in the years following the event, something completely contrary to what one would expect from a devastated ecosystem. There are reports of genetic mutations in the local pine trees and unusual isotopic signatures in the peat bogs, signatures that do not match any known meteorite type. Some researchers have found enriched levels of rare earth elements like iridium, which is often associated with extraterrestrial impacts, but the ratios and distribution are all wrong. They are scattered in a fine layer, not concentrated in fragments, suggesting they were deposited as part of a vapor or plasma. The official story has to stretch and bend to accommodate each of these facts. The comet theory was proposed to explain the lack of a crater, suggesting the entire object vaporized. But a comet is mostly ice. It's unclear if it could have survived deep enough into the atmosphere to create such a powerful shock wave at such a low altitude, estimated to be only 5 to 10 kilometers up. The stony asteroid theory accounts for the power, but not for the complete lack of fragments. Every theory they propose solves one part of the puzzle while making another part more confusing. It is a classic case of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The authorities of science have a hammer, the meteorite impact theory, and so to them, everything looks like a nail. But what if it wasn't a nail? Let us turn our attention away from the skies of Siberia and toward the newspapers of New York City in the years leading up to 1908. Here, a different story was unfolding, a story of a man who was promising to reshape the world with a new form of energy. A man who was already a global celebrity, a figure of both awe and ridicule. Nikola Tesla. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, Tesla was at the peak of his powers, and his name was synonymous with the future. He had already harnessed alternating current, defeating Thomas Edison in the War of the Currents and electrifying the world. But for Tesla, this was just the beginning. His true ambition was far grander. It was to create a global system for the wireless transmission of not just information, but power. Free, limitless energy for all of mankind, broadcast through the Earth and the atmosphere itself. This was not a pipe dream. This was a functioning engineering project. His laboratory in Colorado Springs in 1899 was the proof of concept. There, amidst the Rocky Mountains, he built a massive magnifying transmitter. He generated artificial lightning bolts over 40 meters long. He lit vacuum tubes buried in the ground hundreds of meters away from his tower, with no wires connecting them. He proved that the Earth itself could be used as a vast conductor. In his notes from that period, he wrote with breathless excitement about creating terrestrial stationary waves, vibrations in the planet's electromagnetic field that would allow him to transmit energy to any point on the globe with pinpoint accuracy. He wrote about the destructive potential, too. He claimed that with his system, he could split the Earth itself. Like an apple, he spoke of a teleforce weapon, a particle beam that could bring down fleets of airplanes from hundreds of miles away. The newspapers of the day were filled with these sensational claims. An article in the New York Times in 1907, just a year before Tunguska, quoted Tesla discussing the transmission of electrical energy on a planetary scale. He was not hiding his intentions. He was shouting them from the rooftops. His crowning achievement was meant to be the Wardenclyffe Tower, which he began constructing in Shoreham, Long Island, in 1901. This was to be the first broadcast station in his world wireless system. A 187-foot tower rising above a deep, complex subterranean grounding system. It was a machine of breathtaking ambition. It was designed to pump massive amounts of electrical energy into the Earth's upper atmosphere, the ionosphere, turning the entire planet into a gigantic resonance circuit. The project was funded by the powerful financier J. P. Morgan. But Morgan's vision was limited. He thought he was funding a global radio telegraph system, a way to send stock quotes to London faster than his rivals. When he realized that Tesla's true goal was to transmit power, and that this power would be impossible to meter and sell, he pulled his funding. If anyone can draw on the power, Morgan is reported to have asked, where do we put the meter? It was the ultimate conflict between the humanitarian inventor and the capitalist. Tesla's dream of free energy for the world was a direct threat to the entire economic structure that men like Morgan were building. Wardenclyffe was never fully completed to Tesla's satisfaction. By 1906, he was in financial ruin, and the project was effectively dead. The tower stood for years, a silent monument to a future that never was, before it was finally torn down for scrap in 1917. That is the official story. But what if it isn't the whole story? What if, in the years between 1906 and 1908, a desperate and brilliant Tesla, working with what little resources he had left, managed to conduct one final, clandestine, full-power test of his system? What if he decided to prove to the world, and to the financiers who had abandoned him, that his technology was real? This is where the grand unifying theory begins to take shape. The theory is this: the Tunguska event of June 30th, 1908, was a discharge of energy from the Wardenclyffe Tower or a similar, perhaps smaller, experimental device operated by Nikola Tesla. It was either a weapons test designed to be a show of force or a power transmission experiment that went catastrophically wrong. Let's pose the leading question. If it wasn't a rock from space, what was it? It was a man-made thunderbolt. This theory, often dismissed by mainstream science as outlandish fantasy, explains every single anomaly of the Tunguska event with a chilling elegance. First, the lack of a crater and meteorite fragments. This is the most obvious and powerful piece of evidence. If the destructive force was an energy beam projected from a distance and detonated in the atmosphere, there would be no impactor. There would be no crater. There would be no fragments. The primary mystery of Tunguska is instantly solved. Second, the witness accounts. A pillar of fire descending from the sky is a perfect description of a massive plasma discharge, an electrical arc connecting the ionosphere to the ground. The continuous roaring sound is consistent with the operation of a massive electrical machine. The descriptions of the object changing course or splitting are easily explained by the behavior of plasma in a complex magnetic field. Third, the physical evidence. The butterfly blast pattern could be the result of an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, interacting with the Earth's magnetic field, or the result of a cylindrical or elongated explosion shape, as a beam of energy would be, rather than a point source explosion from a spherical object. The flash burn on the trees without a subsequent forest fire is a hallmark of a massive thermal and radiation pulse, exactly what an atmospheric plasma explosion would create. Fourth, the strange after effects. The glowing skies over Europe and Asia. Tesla's system was designed specifically to excite the upper atmosphere with electrical energy. He wrote about it extensively. He claimed he could light up the night sky and turn night into day along shipping lanes. The glowing skies were not a side effect of a meteor's dust trail. They were a direct and predicted effect of pumping huge quantities of high-frequency energy into the ionosphere. The accelerated tree growth could be a result of the massive release of nitrogen into the soil from the electrically charged air, a phenomenon known as nitrogen fixation, which acts as a powerful fertilizer. The pieces fit. They fit perfectly. Too perfectly, perhaps, for those who have built their careers on the comfortable fiction of a random asteroid. Now we must reinterpret the evidence through this new lens. We must connect the dots between the Siberian wilderness and the mind of the man in New York. Consider the location. Why Tunguska? If Tesla were to conduct a test of a system capable of projecting energy anywhere on the planet, he would need a target. He couldn't risk hitting a populated city. He would need a place that was remote, unpopulated, and difficult for outside observers to reach. Central Siberia in 1908 was arguably the most remote and inaccessible place on the face of the Earth. It was the perfect proving ground. But there is another, more technical reason. To create his terrestrial stationary waves, Tesla needed to send a pulse of energy to the precise antipode, the opposite side of the planet, where the wave would reflect back and reinforce the original signal, creating a resonance. While Siberia is not the exact antipode of Long Island, it is very close to the region he would need to target to study the transmission of energy across the polar regions, an area of unique electromagnetic properties that fascinated him. Some researchers have suggested he was aiming for the North Pole, a symbolic target, and the beam was either deflected by the Earth's magnetic field or his calculations were slightly off. An error of just a few degrees over a distance of thousands of miles would be enough. The institutional antagonist in this story is not a single entity, but a coalition of interests, a conspiracy of the comfortable. First, there was J.P. Morgan and the energy cartels of the early 20th century. They saw the threat of free energy, and they shut it down. They did not want a world where power was as free as the air. They wanted a world of wires, pipes, and meters. They buried Tesla's dream of utopia to protect their profits. After them came mainstream academia. Science, particularly in the early 20th century, was a rigid and dogmatic institution. Tesla was an outsider, a visionary whose ideas were decades, even a century, ahead of his time. His concepts of resonance and wireless power were dismissed as fantasy, the ravings of a madman. When the Tunguska event happened, the scientific establishment had a pre-existing box to put it in, the meteorite box. To even consider an alternative, especially one that validated the madman Tesla, was career suicide. It was easier, safer, to ignore the contradictory evidence and stick to the simple story. Finally, and most powerfully, came the governments of the world, particularly the United States government. When Nikola Tesla died in 1943, alone and in debt in a New York hotel room, agents from the FBI's Office of Alien Property immediately swooped in. They seized all of his property, including trunks full of his research notes, diagrams, and papers. They declared his work top secret. A committee from MIT, led by a certain Dr. John G. Trump, the uncle of the future president, was brought in to evaluate the papers. Their official conclusion was that Tesla's work was mostly speculative and philosophical, and contained no principles that could not also be found in the work of other scientists. This is perhaps the most audacious lie of all. They took the life's work of the greatest inventive mind in modern history, the man who designed the electrical grid that powers our entire civilization, and they declared it to be of no value. At the same time, they classified it at the highest level of national security. These two actions are fundamentally contradictory. You do not classify worthless speculation. You classify things that are dangerous. You classify things that are powerful. You classify weapons. Many of Tesla's most important papers have never been seen again. They vanished into the black hole of the national security state. The documents that have been released through Freedom of Information Act requests are heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out. What was in those missing notes? Did they contain the precise diagrams and calculations for the world wireless system? Did they contain a logbook of experiments? Did they contain an entry for June 30th, 1908, with a target designated as Siberia? This is where the work of the modern seeker becomes so vital. Independent researchers, men and women operating outside the confines of institutional funding and peer-reviewed dogma, have spent decades piecing together the puzzle. They are the intellectual descendants of Tesla himself. People like Dr. Alastair Finch, a composite of many real-world researchers, who has dedicated his life to cross-referencing Tesla's released patents, his public statements, his private letters, and the known physics of atmospheric electricity. Finch and others like him have built a compelling case, a mountain of circumstantial evidence that points in only one direction. They point to an entry in Tesla's journal from 1907, where he writes of a new transmitter design, one that could be projected through the terrestrial globe and released at a predetermined point. They point to eyewitness accounts from residents of Long Island in the months leading up to the Tunguska event, who reported strange lights and electrical phenomena emanating from the Wardenclyffe Tower at night, long after it was officially supposed to have been shut down. They point to Tesla's sudden and panicked efforts to dismantle parts of his own equipment in late 1908, as if trying to hide or disable something. Finch's work highlights a chilling quote from a letter Tesla wrote to a friend in 1909. In it, he speaks of a great disturbance he had recently caused and expressed a profound regret that his work might be used for destructive ends. Was this a veiled confession? A moment of conscience from a man who had accidentally unleashed the power of a god on an unsuspecting wilderness. Now, we must globalize the pattern. The suppression of Tesla's work and the mystery of Tunguska are not isolated events. They are part of a larger story, a story of a technological leap that was deliberately stifled. The years around 1908 were filled with strange phenomena that, when viewed in isolation, seem like curiosities. But when viewed through the lens of the Tesla theory, they begin to look like a pattern of experimentation. In 1903, the year Wardenclyffe became operational, there were reports from sailors in the Atlantic of the entire ocean surface being illuminated from below by a strange, pulsing light. In 1906, strange atmospheric flashes were reported over Australia. Let's not forget Admiral Byrd's later expeditions to the polar regions, where he and his crews reported bizarre and unexplained lights in the sky and magnetic anomalies that sent their compasses spinning wildly. Tesla was fascinated with the poles. He believed they were the key points, the terminals of the great terrestrial dynamo. Was he using them as part of his global circuit? He himself made the extraordinary claim in 1899 that he was receiving intelligent signals from space, possibly from Mars. The scientific community ridiculed him. But what if he wasn't receiving signals from another planet? What if he was detecting the reflected echo of his own signals, bouncing off the ionosphere or circling the globe? What if he had mistaken the first successful test of his own global system for alien communication? It would be a mistake born of the sheer, unprecedented scale of what he had created. All of these disparate events, these odd footnotes in history, can be seen as part of a unified whole. They are the sparks and crackles of a new global machine being brought online for the first time. They are the system tests, the power-ups, the calibration shots. This global pattern points to a single, interconnected, pre-catastrophe technology. The catastrophe, in this case, was not a natural disaster, but a man-made one. It was the decision to shut it down, to bury it, to pretend it never happened. And this is what makes the Tunguska event so unique. While the other events were subtle, perhaps low-power tests, Tunguska was the main event. This was the full-power demonstration. This was the moment the system was fired at or near its maximum capacity. It was the shot heard and felt around the world. And it may have terrified its own creator. Imagine the scene. Nikola Tesla, in his New York laboratory, perhaps using a smaller, hidden version of his transmitter, initiates the sequence. He directs a pulse of unimaginable energy into the Earth, aimed at a remote point thousands of miles away. He watches his instruments, expecting to see a surge of power, perhaps a discharge in the atmosphere. But the resonance is far greater than he calculated. The feedback loop is more powerful than he ever imagined. The energy released is not a controlled discharge, but a cataclysmic, uncontrolled explosion. An explosion with the force of 1,000 suns. In that moment, he would have realized two things. First, that his system worked beyond his wildest dreams. And second, that it was far too powerful for mankind to control. He had built a weapon that could wipe out entire nations in an instant, a system that could accidentally crack the planet. The man who wanted to give the world free energy had instead created the ultimate doomsday machine. Is it any wonder he might have spent the rest of his life in silence, taking his greatest secret to the grave? This brings us to the final, critical question, the synthesis of it all. What was the motive for the suppression? Why has this story been so thoroughly and ruthlessly buried for over a century? The motives are layered, each one darker than the last. At the most basic level, it is about protecting academic dogma. The entire edifice of 20th century geology, astronomy, and physics is built on a certain set of assumptions about the world. The Tunguska event, as a Tesla-induced event, shatters those assumptions. It introduces a wild card, a technological singularity in 1908 that doesn't fit the neat timeline of scientific progress. It is easier for the institution of science to invent ever more complex theories about exploding ice comets than to admit that a lone genius, a man they had scorned, had lapped them all by a century and created something they still don't fully understand. To admit the truth about Tunguska would be to admit their own blindness. The next layer is economic. As J. P. Morgan understood all too well, Tesla's technology was a threat to the entire global economic system. A world of free, limitless energy is a world without oil companies, without coal mines, without utility bills. It is a world where the fundamental scarcity that drives our economy is eliminated. This would trigger a revolution on a scale never before seen. Power, real power, would be decentralized. It would be taken from the hands of the few and given to the many. The powers that be, the institutions that profit from that scarcity, could not and would not ever allow that to happen. They had to bury the technology, and burying the truth of its most dramatic demonstration at Tunguska was the first step. But the deepest, darkest motive is military. The moment the U.S. government seized Tesla's papers in 1943, the technology ceased to be a tool for utopia and became a weapon. Think of the programs that followed. Project Argus in the 1950s involved detonating nuclear weapons in the upper atmosphere to study their effect on the ionosphere. The HARP program in Alaska, officially a research station to study the ionosphere, has long been accused of being a weather control and energy weapon system based on Tesla's principles. The Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, envisioned directed energy weapons in space. Are these all independent lines of research? Or are they the slow, secret, and clumsy attempts by the military-industrial complex to reverse engineer the work Tesla had already perfected in 1908? Are they spending billions of dollars to reinvent a technology that was taken out of a trunk in a hotel room in 1943? The suppression of the truth about Tunguska is not just about hiding a historical event. It is an active, ongoing cover-up of a technology that is currently in the hands of the deepest, most secretive parts of the state. They do not want us to know what happened in Siberia because they do not want us to know what they are capable of now. The story of a random meteor is a comforting lullaby to keep the public asleep while the real work continues in the shadows. We must return, at the end, to the man himself, to the human element in this story of cosmic power. In one of his last interviews, an elderly and isolated Nikola Tesla was asked about his work. His response, paraphrased from the accounts of those who heard it, serves as a final, haunting testimony. He spoke of the great responsibility that came with great knowledge. He said, with a profound sadness, "I could split the earth, but I do not. Who would I be to do such a thing?" Was this the boast of an old man, lost in his memories? Or was it the quiet confession of someone who had once stood on the brink of that very abyss, stared into the fire of his own creation, and made the conscious choice to step back? He had the power to be a destroyer of worlds, and he chose to be a broken, forgotten man instead. Perhaps that was his final, greatest act of service to humanity. The truth of what happened at Tunguska does not lie buried in a crater that was never there. It is not hidden in the far reaches of the solar system. It is here on Earth. It is in the redacted files of the FBI. It is in the principles of resonance and atmospheric electricity that are still, to this day, not fully taught in our universities. It is in the strange, anomalous weather patterns and the unexplained atmospheric booms that are reported around the world. The truth, like energy, cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to another. It can be suppressed, hidden, and lied about for a time. But eventually, inevitably, it will resonate. The evidence remains, written in the rings of the Siberian trees, echoed in the words of the Evenki people, and locked away in the missing papers of the man who played with lightning. The official story of Tunguska is a crater, a 114-year-old lie, designed to make us feel small and insignificant in a dangerous, random cosmos. The truth is far more illuminating and far more terrifying. They didn't just cover up a meteor impact. They buried the dawn of a new age.